Okay, good. When I wrote the agenda, I had no idea we were going to be where we are today. So there's a lot of elephants that are not mentioned in there. And I was actually in Paris for an Arab Energy Club meeting, and it was surprising that nobody really wanted to touch upon the more sensitive issues at hand. And that was before the attack on Iran by the United States. But I left Dubai, about 10 days ago, and we had to dodge Missile Alley, as they're calling it now, because we were stuck on the plane for about an hour because so much airspace is closed that we had to go one way, and it became very, very congested. And one of the consequences, I think, of what's happening now, and we're not really talking about it very much, and I'd like to hear Tim's opinion on how it's going to impact the economies of the Gulf region, because what we're seeing, and the theme of what I wanted to talk about before all the madness, was how the Gulf states, the national oil companies in the Gulf states have become more assertive, they've become more global. There's not so much regional integration because I think there's still a lot of mistrust, which is why I was a bit surprised to see everybody in the GCC, the Arab countries, sort of rising to the defense of Qatar. They boycotted just a few years earlier. So, today is my enemy's enemy is my friend, and all that kind of stuff. And what I find really surprising is, they've had, they are cash rich, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. The economies are doing quite well, despite ups and downs and volatility in oil. But it's not being translated. They are investing. They've gone global. We see a lot of investment in US LNG. We see it in Australia, in Africa. But we're not seeing that kind of clout being translated into sort of political, diplomatic pressure to sort of try to resolve all these issues that we're facing at the moment. So I have a really excellent panel here. I couldn't ask for better. And I'm going to start from sort of in order to my left. So we have Colby Connelly, who's a senior fellow in the Economics and Energy Program at the Middle East Institute, and he's a senior analyst at Energy Intelligence. I meant to my far left. Sorry. I'm still a bit jet lagged. I've done about 3 continents already. Colby's a friend of AGSIW. We've been together for a long time. He's been here many, many times. And he looks at political trends in the Middle East, North Africa, including oil markets, OPEC plus geopolitics, and the regional effects of the energy transition. He also contributes to competitive intelligence research, looking at corporate strategies and developments in the region. So, Colby, nice to have you back with us. Of course, Karen Young needs no introduction. She's very well known. She's a political economist focusing on the Gulf, broader Middle East and North Africa region, and the intersection of energy, finance, and security. She's a senior research scholar at the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. She was a senior fellow and funding director of the program on economics and energy in the Middle East Institute, and a resident scholar at the American Scholar. Sorry, I'm really not doing too well at the American Enterprises. Yeah, I know I can. It's a long list, so I'm going to stop. You can read it on the website. And last but not least is Phillip Cornell, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. He's a specialist in energy and foreign policy, global energy markets and regulatory issues, critical energy infrastructure protection, energy security strategy and policy, Saudi oil policy, Gulf energy economics, and blah. Okay, yes, I'll stop. It's not embarrassing, and I'm not going to introduce myself because, I've been doing this for a very long time, but I noticed something today. We've just, the Energy Institute, where I'm a fellow and on the board of their Middle East branch, has put out the statistical review of energy, which will come out officially on the 26th. And what I saw from the advanced copy is that emissions are rising. For the 4th year they've risen, which, considering we're seeing electrification, considering we're seeing so much investment in renewables, and a lot of it in the Gulf states. And I think that is something that doesn't get so much notice. There was a time when I used to say, Petro Diplomacy, we should maybe get rid of the petrol, but now it's in vogue again, right? So we are seeing investments as sort of a two-track investment policy in renewables alongside oil and gas, because we need it. And I look at the market today and I'm thinking, why is it fallen below 70 when there's so much uncertainty? Talk about the Strait of Hormuz. And it's not just the signal jamming, it's the fact that we have this dark fleet that's bobbing around with GPS switched off. The risk is rising because you don't even know where these ships are. They're doing ship-to-ship transfers, they're bobbing around. Some of them appear to be on water, some of them appear to be on land. So there is still a risk, isn't there? We're seeing insurance rates go up, we're seeing a risk more maybe to LNG exports because oil has a way out of the region from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, outside of Strait of Hormuz, but not so much LNG, which has an impact on poor Qatar, which sort of bore the brunt of the response by Iran, even if it was sort of choreographed. So I wanted to sort of get your opinion of how we also saw Donald Trump in the Gulf being feted like, the king, and this $2 trillion in investments that has been pledged. I mean, some of it already done, some of it to come, maybe. MOUs don't really mean anything, but is that going to be something that the Gulf states will use, or are they? Do you see them using it as sort of clout, political clout, to sort of influence events and diplomacy in the region and beyond? We've seen the UAE is very active now in North Africa, Sudan, not to everybody's liking, but is that something that you see happening because of the fact that they do have this sort of financial clout and the promise of investment into the US? But at the same time, what is it doing? What is this crisis doing to inward investment, to FDI, which I think Saudi Arabia badly needs at the moment? Their latest IPO is not doing too well. And the sort of basically the GCC economy, which is still pretty reliant on oil and gas. How is that going to have an impact? Is there going to be a flight of capital? Are we going to see are we going to see an impact on the GCC countries? Phillip, I give it to you first.
Well, thanks very much, Kate, and it's really a pleasure to be back at the Petro Diplomacy conference. I think there were many parts to your question, but I guess we'll start off with talking about sort of the oil market and where it is right now, because to your point, that has a big impact on what's sort of the strength of the GCC economy as a result, and how does it sort of confer some power. In terms of where the oil price has gone just in very recent days and weeks as a result of this crisis, you said you were surprised that we see it going down right now. I think that the oil market has been pretty sanguine around prices, particularly over the last week or so. There was a bit of a jump last Friday. But otherwise, look, traders in the market remember 2019 and attacks on Abqaiq, and several other sort of scares of disruption that have happened over the past decade, where sort of betting on the upside has always led to a loss and a burn. And so I think at this point, the market is very much thinking, look, we're going to bet on real disruption when we see it and not on some kind of fear of that disruption. Pardon me. And I would say that's exactly the same response from OPEC, from representatives of GCC countries to OPEC, and we're going to see probably in the meeting in early July. I mean, all of the sounds have been, we're going to keep doing what had been planned in terms of ramping back up from a previous cut. But there's not going to be any sort of deviation of policy as a result of geopolitics that are happening until we see something that's quite real. And I think, given what we've seen over the past couple of days and this sort of, at least for the moment, kind of fizzling of what had been a potential flashpoint, I think you see the market really sort of going back to what is the structural reality of the global oil market at the moment, which leans on almost all points to the downside, right? I mean, we see kind of a glutton supply, at least in the short term. Again, OPEC sort of raising their production again. Spare capacity is doing okay. Demand, I mean, especially when we go to a new round of tariff stuff later in the summer, all of that is a downside for global demand in the economy. So I think the trend broadly, at least in sort of the medium term, is very much to the downside for oil prices. But that certainly doesn't mean that the GCC is flush with cash and certainly has the power that you're talking about as kind of a capital source. And I think we see that very clearly when it comes to things like digital technology and AI that they're betting a lot of their future on. I think, to be really honest, many of them would be very happy not to have to deal with Iran, not to have to deal with Palestinians too much. They want to focus on, moving their economies forward, diversifying into sort of digital leadership, recognizing the sort of power that they can get out of that, or the leverage that they have given sort of cheap land, cheap energy, and all of that to come closer, for example, to the US and to Trump, but also to look to alternatives. So I'll just give a quick mention about you mentioned a few North African countries, but I would say even thinking about the GCC and the power it's leveraging looking east to Asia, I think we all know that, GCC oil and gas supply, particularly from places like Saudi Arabia, for a long time now, I mean, the US and North America has accounted for a very tiny bit of that. Almost all of it is going to Asia, and that's where growth is. And that's where growth is on the oil and gas side, also on power consumption, power demand. So for all the talk about AI power demand, if you talk to any of the producers of turbines, they'll tell you very much that, okay, maybe my stock price is affected by AI news, but almost all of those turbines are locked in emerging markets in South and Southeast Asia, as well as other parts of the world. So what they're doing going east, and I'll also plug very quickly at the Atlantic Council, we just launched last week, some work on what we call Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean. So looking at how, particularly over the last 4 to 6 years, this big push that seems to be pretty deliberate from a lot of GCC countries to upgrade relationships, not just in places like India, where there's been a fair amount of downstream investment from places like ADNOC and Saudi Aramco over the past decade, but even to places like Southeast Asia, where in the UAE in particular has been signing this sort of raft of comprehensive economic partnership agreements, have been investing significantly into clean energy and advanced energy technologies in places like Malaysia, where the UAE has made sort of a 10 gigawatt commitment, but also places that are looking at things like green hydrogen, which we can debate whether there's really a future there. Oman is really keen on it, and obviously there have been sort of agreements also from the Saudi PIF in places like South Asia over that. But all in all, using that kind of strength, I think that they have as a source of capital and a source of technology, as well as a source of fossil fuels, to upgrade those relationships and gain some political leverage. I mean, I think this plays into a bigger sort of narrative, which is, if we see sort of fracturing of global order, whether it has to do with trade policy or geostrategic and security policy, not to be too sort of IR wonky about it, but some kind of balancing instinct. So as sort of before there had been sort of pretty clear focus on big pole partners, whether that was Washington, whether that was Beijing, whether that was Europe. And I think there's an instinct over the past several years has been to sort of revisit some of those second-tier relationships in the near area where there just happens to be great markets that are booming, but also to sort of sort of hedge, I would say, some of their relationships as they do, much to your point, think about going more international, thinking about having a more independent strategic orientation. And that has meant diversification, both from an economic point of view and from a political point of view. And I think that there's a lot of implications of that, which we can talk to. The last thing I'll say on that whole sort of balancing thesis, which I think does kind of hold true, there doesn't mean that, as we saw with Trump's visit to the GCC, that there's not a opportunity that they are going to take by hitching their wagon, particularly around things like digital and AI, where there's a clear partnership and there's a great source of capital going in both directions and technology exchange in order for them to keep leadership. So I think a lot of their mind is not so much on oil and gas markets. It's looking to what's coming in the future, because they do see that that's where their bread is buttered. It's not just magnanimity.
Well, and as we saw from sort of extreme heat here, I think it's hotter here than it is in Dubai at the moment. But there is a climate emergency. I mean, they do need to do something. And they are. I mean, Masdar is one of the biggest investors in renewable and clean energy around the world, not just regional. Karen, Your views. And we decided we're not going to have presentations, we're just going to have a sort of roundtable discussion. So,
yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, Kate, for organizing this whole agenda. And thank you to AGSIW for inviting me back. It's really good to be with you all. So I want to start with this question you asked you asked about economic statecraft. And I wrote a book about Gulf economic statecraft a couple of years ago. And it was focused on how the Gulf states have intervened really after the Arab Spring within the region, using economic tools to achieve political ends. So foreign direct investment, commitments of oil and gas in kind transfers, central bank deposits. They were really good at it for a decade, and they used it as transformative foreign policy, particularly in Egypt, but also in places like Sudan and Ethiopia, also in Pakistan, and even within the GCC, within countries like Oman. I think phase 2 is happening now, and it's very, very early. So this idea of using both the priority of economic diversification and transformation at home, and using those tools as outward investment mechanisms, particularly through the creation of new adjacent sovereign funds like XRG, which is an ADNOC, basically, entity, is a mechanism to do so, but it's very much nascent and forward-looking. I wrote a paper almost 10 years ago about the Gulf's eastward turn, this idea of looking at the connections in Asia as the future of income for the region, and certainly not just in oil and gas, but particularly in petrochemicals and also in new energy. And that has come to pass, and certainly as Phillip describes, this is what matters. Trade flows from the Gulf to Asia are increasing. They're meant to increase even more in reciprocal trade in the next 10 years. But interestingly, 2024 was the first year in which foreign direct investment was at parity between the Middle East, mostly the Gulf, and Asia. So the Gulf is investing as much in Asia as Asia is putting back into the Gulf. That's really important when you think about a political orientation and where those tools of economic statecraft might be directed. It's also true that, particularly in the use of these investment vehicles from the UAE, from Saudi Arabia, are very interested in the energy sector in rich countries, in the United States, but also in Europe. And that we saw in the president's visit, these commitments of investments into the U.S., mostly into LNG, but a lot also into the potential for renewable, even into CCS in Texas, which got axed by President Trump's decisions on, what the Department of Energy could give in terms of loans and benefits to some new energy efforts. And that signals, I think, to me, an effort to, yes, also have political influence. If you control most or a lot of the LNG terminals in Texas and Louisiana, or you have a 30% stake in the biggest ones, that is political influence, that is power, that is statecraft. But they're not exercising it to the point that we saw what they did within their own region after 2011. Maybe 10 years from now that will happen. So, kind of referencing back to the previous panel, and I think Ambassador Waba's very good question, what does that mean in terms of their relationship within the region and the hegemony that we're seeing emerge? They're not quite ready to exercise on a global scale in relationships with their key trade partners, China, India to the east, nor to what they see as still the security umbrella to the west. So I think it's something to watch, but it's also something that from a U.S. domestic and foreign policy perspective, we probably don't pay enough attention to. And this is very, very clear in the AI race, for example. What does it mean from a CFIUS perspective, to have such very, very strong and concentrated in the form of sovereign investors ownership of strategic assets in the United States and those ties. So this is something that I think we'll be looking at 10 years from now and thinking, oh golly, did we make a mistake or did we make a really smart partnership? And I don't know that there's a clear answer because there's still so much uncertainty in the stability of the region itself. I want to say more on the decoupling issue, but maybe I'll save that.
Okay.
Price and risk, regional risk.
Yeah, I think I just saw something, the war premium, which is maybe about $10, is now gone while people wait for the next stage of whatever is going to happen. And who knows? Colby, I wanted to hear your comments and also where Russia stands in all of this, because, with all the investment in US LNG, the Europeans wanting to reduce their reliance on Russian gas by 2027. I don't think it's going to happen by then, but, that there's CBAM coming in, which is the carbon, basically a carbon tax by the EU. How's that going to impact? I think China's very worried about it. But I think where does Russia stand as sort of the partner within the OPEC Plus, which is sort of held together despite all the tensions, and how the sort of the global energy sort of landscape is changing, and how do you sort of maintain this alliance with Russia, but at the same time compete with Russia, particularly in Asia, and now with all these LNG investments.
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and thanks, of course, to AGSI for getting us together again for another fantastically timed Petro Diplomacy. I think that there's been a couple of those, so I don't know how you do it, but it definitely deserves recognition. Yeah, so I think, on the OPEC Plus front, it's been interesting, and I think the kind of investment patterns you've seen have been evident for a little while, that we're only unwinding the third layer of cuts at this point. We're still not into the first two that started really in 2022. And I don't know if I think it's one of the key motivators for the way some of the Gulf countries and their NOCs are changing their investment patterns, but you do see a lot more of an interest, not just in gas, but in other liquids as well, given that OPEC Plus quotas only govern crude output. So certainly, some of the projects that have been tendered with Jafurah in Saudi Arabia and where a lot of Omani production has gone has put a lot more emphasis on those other liquids as well. I think it's interesting when you look at where some of the recent upstream interest has been within the OPEC group. The UAE's upstream is of course always attractive, but you've got Total and BP now going back into Iraq, or at least expanding their footprints there. We'll have to see what the results of the Libyan bid round are, but if the reporting that's going on out there is any indication, there's certainly a lot of interest in it. And it's notable that I think, at least in the case of Iraq and Libya, one country doesn't have a quota and one basically acts like it doesn't have a quota. I think if you're looking longer term at how countries in the Gulf, particularly one that's had some disagreements with where its quota is in OPEC Plus over the years, will try to approach their upstream trajectory. I think that's something that has to at least be on the radar. It's too soon to speculate too much about what that does to the future of the organization. But if you're competing for a share of upstream investment that is, at least in theory, going to potentially shrink a bit over the coming years, we'll see. It's almost a non-statement that having to consider an OPEC quota is not an incentive, to say the least. I think that's something that the organization will have to think about in terms of what it has to do to keep itself together in the coming years. Obviously not a problem that Russia's going to have for the moment. Outside of the region, though, I think just building on some of the things that Karen said that were really important, is that the NOCs from a lot of countries, I tend to focus on Aramco, ADNOC, and Qatar Energy, which I think of as sort of the triumvirate of the most active firms in the region, and certainly the ones with the most interesting strategies. they're continuing this very, very strong shift from being a large group of, predominantly domestic resource holding operators to companies that are behaving a lot more like, I don't necessarily want to say IOCs because there's, I guess, changes in what that even is anymore, but their strategies are getting much more interesting to the point where they're active investors and portfolio managers in the oil and gas industry writ large, which changes a lot of the implications for their own future, but I think has a lot of implications for the future of the oil and gas industry itself if these firms are much bigger players outside of their home countries. It's mostly something that, I think Karen pointed out has come really in the LNG and chemical space. New energy has sort of worked its way in there, but given that you've either got, some diminishing incentives for some of those things, or the fact that a lot of these countries already have a national champion that deals with that segment itself, there's not really a need for instance, Aramco to become a huge renewables developer when you've already got aqua power. That it just doesn't make sense. So, with the exception, I think, of Qatar Energy, it's really kind of a search for some advantaged gas and LNG assets. If you're Aramco, it's mostly LNG. XRG clearly has a different view to what they're interested in getting involved with. And to some of Karen's points, I think it's a little difficult sometimes to tell where the kind of, political and economic statecraft might be the governing part of the thinking there, but it's hard to say that they've gone into places that at least commercially don't make sense. They haven't done that. And there's an undeniable, I think, political advantage to investing in the U.S., obviously, at this time, although it's something that started before the second iteration of the Trump administration. It's something that they had alluded to the idea that they might do for some time. Aramco was talking about going into Port Arthur before the pandemic, and we've now just gotten to a point where some of these things are being realized. So I'd be a little bit cautious about reading into the political influence as the longest term part of the goal, because, who knows what the next political U-turn in the United States will be. It has to be a consideration, and at that point, maybe new energy investment becomes a bigger priority. We'll see. I think, I'm glad to know I'm maybe not the only hydrogen skeptic on the panel, but I've had plenty of proverbial fruit thrown at me at different events for saying some of those things. But, the idea, I think, behind that is one that'll be interesting to watch. But given some of the moves that have been made recently with Aramco kind of building a bigger portfolio of LNG offtake, a lot of which is going to come from the United States, XRG with this interest in Santos, that is something that I don't think is going to stop. I think it's definitely going to continue. As you especially see different institutions in the West, maybe more so Europe than the United States right now, a little hesitant to touch oil and gas. The Gulf NOCs will become increasingly prolific investors in this space. I think there are some long-term questions that brings up, particularly, post COP28 with that having been hosted in the UAE. I was in London a couple years ago before that happened, and there was an official from a Gulf energy ministry who was very, very proudly saying that with this coming to the Gulf, we're making ourselves, a stakeholder in this discussion rather than just an object of it. And if they are going to become bigger stakeholders in the oil and gas industry, what does that do to their influence on sort of the pace and the trajectory of the transition? I think there's a lot of pessimism about where the transition goes for the time being. But, there was a big sea change in 2020 with the pandemic. We all rushed to a lot of conclusions that a lot of us have since done 180s on. So I think it's appropriate to think about where we're going from here with a little bit of the same thought. The second question I think about the trajectory of this is if prices are lower for longer, and as Phil was rightly pointing out, we're probably looking mostly to the downside right now. How long does this continue? I keep singling out XRG a lot, but they started with, I think, an $80 billion portfolio. They want to double that in size over the next couple of years. That's going to require an enormous amount of investment. So it'll be interesting to see how that materializes and what the behavior will look like in a period of lower for longer, if that's where we go. It's notable that none of these NOCs have really come out and made major revisions to their CapEx guidance during this period. So for the most part, for now, it seems like they're quite determined to invest through a downturn, or at least the down cycle. And then, again, I think just with the new energy part of this taking a bit of a backseat for the time being, I wouldn't write off the idea that it is something that, the NOCs or some of their counterpart national champions will come back to outside of their home countries. I mean, it's not taking the biggest hit in some places, but that I think, again, I just caution against too much of the nearer term thinking with a lot of the pessimism that there has been around the transition right now. And so I'll leave it there, but that's always a particularly exciting space to watch. And so I look forward to hearing what more we can get into about it.
Thank you, Colby. I think, in many ways, isn't the US setting the agenda for the sort of the climate agenda and the sort of the drill, baby, drill mantra, which I think is being sort of replicated. And we're seeing a lot of the major energy companies, as they like to call themselves now, increasing their upstream investments to the detriment of their sort of climate agenda. But talking about hydrogen skepticism, yes, I agree. And if you look at the number of investments, or the amount of investment that's been announced since 2020, we're talking about 700 billion. But it's a tiny percentage that actually goes to final investment decisions because it's still too costly. And even Aramco, I think, said it recently. He said, if I don't have an off-taker for blue hydrogen, and blue hydrogen is sort of easier because the gas is there and it's cheap inside, that they cannot go ahead with the investment if they don't have an off-taker. And I think that's a problem for a lot of these green hydrogen projects. But I want to open it up now because we really do want to have a discussion around the table. So I'm going to stop talking and open it up. So if anybody has any questions, comments they'd like to make to our speakers, please go ahead. Yes.
Here we go. Thank you. Hi. But the comment I want to make is on drill, baby, drill. I don't think it's going to be done by the U.S. energy industry. It's going to be done by producers in the Middle East and Latin America and other places. So it'll be interesting that the president will be stating that mantra to the wrong audience. But and then on the new energy side, I think a lot of that's also going to be done by the same group, particularly in the Middle East, because they can. They don't have to ask anybody. They don't need to have rules set up. They don't have to have rules pulled away. So I don't know if I was a question. I guess it's two statements, but I think the Middle East in particular will be very relevant to incremental crude oil production and the continued creation of new energy.
No, I really appreciate that comment. I agree that, look, we listened to Paul at the very beginning of this morning saying that the number one need for his oil and gas company is policy and political stability. And if you look to the Gulf countries and the GCC, whether we're talking about oil and gas investments or whether we're talking about renewable energy investments, the cost of capital is remarkably low. And that doesn't have to do with any kind of public capital. That's literally because it's a safe place to invest and much lower cost of capital than you get here even. And so, I think when you are talking about either drill, baby, drill, or going hard at electrification, it's going to follow where the demand is, and I think if we're talking about a trade-off between, let's say, established renewable energy technologies and natural gas for power generation, for example, I think that's literally going to follow the price. Where it's hydrogen, for example, where there's a clear trade-off in price, at least over the medium term, let's say 5 to 7 years, between price and emissions, yeah, they're going to be struggling. But that certainly doesn't mean that there's a huge amount of appetite, both in Middle East investors, Asian investors, and European investors. Since I've been in the mood of sort of touting our recent work, we also did some work with Ernie Moniz's shop that we launched last week as well, surveying energy sector investors, the top-level energy sector investors from sort of different regions. And the outlook by technology suite really reflected the kind of discussion we're having right now, which is for things like stable renewable energy grids, even things like nuclear, there was a very strong appetite. As you start going lower down the chain to things like hydrogen or to e-fuels or to CCS that are really much more policy supported, the appetite gets a lot weaker. So I think to your point, the GCC is extremely attractive because of the investment environment, because of the market there, as much as anything else.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, you're exactly right. But the thing that I think is interesting about the sovereign investment vehicles that are especially in the renewable space is that they can be, and in the oil and gas space too, I should say, like XRG would fall into that. They can be extremely opportunistic in the environments they choose to enter, including in the United States. And they also have a very patient view of a return on investment. They can really take a long-term perspective, which, IOCs, most corporates can't. And that's why, yeah, there may not be such a drive to increase production in the Permian, certainly not at $60 a barrel, but there will be opportunities to buy up assets. And I think that's what we're seeing in LNG. That's what we're going to see even in like the carbon management, direct air capture, and CCS. But that's happening too in the way that the renewable companies, especially in like solar power generation from Aqua or from Masdar, are able to deploy across emerging markets. So I have a tracker at Columbia called the Gulf Renewable Power Tracker. And so we have a visualization of data of all of the Aqua and Masdar projects outside of the GCC, so on a global scale. And so these are, thinking about, Mona and I were talking about this last night, the opportunism for entering particularly a development finance space for infrastructure investment is really huge right now. The US has stepped back. Our vehicles are not available, even when they were not operating on the same scale. USAID is not building power plants anywhere. The DFC is not building anything right now. And the Gulf states can enter that space. And I do think that has an economic statecraft element, even if it's not exercised at this moment. You've got a 30-year offtake agreement. You're linked in. You're friends. And so I think that is, it's just going to be enormous, the kind of relationship and business opportunity that creates. So, yeah, again, totally dominant, able to deploy quickly, able to create new investment vehicles, like that, and none of the paperwork or the kind of policy headaches that we encounter in our own landscape, particularly on the renewable side.
Yeah, there's no NIMBYism in our part of the world, and where I live in Dubai. I think part of it is, yes, there is stability. There is, who you trust your leadership to do the right thing. You come to a place like the UAE, you look at Saudi Arabia, the way it's growing. I mean, it's quite amazing. But you've got the roads, you've got the infrastructure. People don't question their leaders. It's like, okay, decision is made, it gets implemented, and so. You go to London and you look at roadworks and they take months and months and months, whereas in Dubai, buildings sprout overnight, roadworks are done efficiently. So I think there isn't that kind of pushback. But Colby, did you want to say anything, or shall I still open it up to more comments?
Yeah, no, I'd see another question out there.
You see another question? Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question regarding OPEC plus dynamics and what that might mean for relationships within the Gulf if we are, the Saudis are allegedly, in terms of increasing their production or trying to punish, Iraq among others. if we are in a world where oil demand is going to peak within the next few years, what does that do to all of these relationships, and including among the Gulf producers themselves?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. It's one I spend a lot of time thinking about. I mean, I think I was trying to highlight where one of the potential cracks might eventually be in that longer term, especially if, that you're looking at a demand situation where there are, plenty of varying opinions on when we hit a peak, but let's say, 2030 or thereabouts. There's going to be a drive to attract as much of this upstream investment and monetize resources while you still can, and a quota is no kind of incentive to do that. I think for the time being, a lot of the thinking can kind of be traced back to a certain saying about elephants and tents, and being better to have them inside than out. So the members of the group clearly have benefit from being a part of it. If we do see a high profile exit, which there hasn't been in a while, then where the cracks may be emerging, if they do emerge, would be a lot more clear. I don't want to suggest that that's imminent, because clearly there's an effort to give certain members a wide enough berth to have an incentive to stay involved. But when you have overproducers like Kazakhstan, which is an interesting example because it's part of the plus of OPEC plus. It's not a founding member, so it's got contracts that go back to the 90s to develop some of these mega projects. It doesn't have a very dominant NOC in the way that some of the other Gulf countries do, so the external capacities are much more of an essential feature for them. That's really important, and if it becomes this kind of existential thing where you're so dependent on these revenues and you want to just get the barrels out, because this is a pie that's eventually going to start shrinking, that's, I think, something that is going to continue to be a headache in the long term. And I think the amount of times that you are able to invoke the one real tool to punish overproducers, which is really just to raise production, and there's only a handful of members in the group that can really do that. Most of the spare capacity is in the same place. That kind of a threat is eventually going to, in theory, become less impactful. But we have to see. In the short term, I really think that everyone that is involved is going to benefit more by being a member than by looking for the door. And it's going to take a lot for that to change.
I was going to add to that. I mean, I've been looking at OPEC for, a very long time, decades. And it seems to me these days, these quotas are more suggestions than actual quotas, because, you look at Kazakhstan, you look at Iraq, which is overproducing. They're supposed to make up for it. So on paper, it looks like they're increasing production, but in reality, they're not. And if you're an investor and you're looking at IEA and OPEC forecasts, I mean, the IEA says from 2028, demand is going to fall dramatically to peak by 2030, and it's going to slow to a trickle in the last 2 years of the decade. Whereas if you look at the long-term projections, OPEC sees demand continuing for its oil. But if the IEA is correct, and in fact, I think the difference is about 50 million barrels between the IEA's forecast, long-term forecast, and the OPEC, which is huge, and the diversity. And the relationship between the two is becoming quite tense. But if the IEA is correct, and they're talking about, demand being driven by petrochemicals, gas demand by electrification and so on, and EVs, they're far more pessimistic on demand growth than the OPEC is, then it's going to become more difficult for the OPEC countries to maintain this cohesion, because, the UAE is producing above quota as well. We don't talk about it very much, but they are. We don't really know the exact number. But they've been allowed to do it because in order to maintain that cohesion, and I think the reason why they started increasing production now when things were so uncertain is because they can. There is some demand, and it's a good time for them to do it. But I don't think it's only to punish the overproducers. I think there's, it's like, let's make hay while the sun shines. And I think they're doing that now and also complete it. But I think it's a very uncertain time. But they have held together. I mean, if you look at OPEC's history and OPEC Plus now with Russia and Saudi Arabia, I think they find that alliance quite useful for both. It gives Russia a sort of international platform of sorts. And they've held together through the Iran-Iraq war, the invasion of Kuwait, they've managed it. So we have more questions, I think. Sorry, kept you waiting. But.
Hi, it's Mimi Burke from Brownstein. I just came from a meeting this morning at the Embassy of Egypt, and they shared with us some of their new financial burdens with this conflict, the new conflict in the Middle East, because they receive some of their oil through the pipeline in Israel that was closed down in the past days. And they had to scramble in the high usage months of the summer to find alternate measures to fill their needs. Could you talk a little bit about how this very short war has affected some of the countries in the region or elsewhere in their new financial consideration with energy?
I'm just going to make one comment. It's actually Israeli gas which keeps it going, which keeps the lights on in Egypt. And yes, they shut down some of the fields protectively, two of the large offshore Mediterranean fields. And I think one of the problems Egypt has at the moment is that they have ordered these floating LNG import facilities, which haven't been all connected because they haven't got the infrastructure ready yet to connect them. So I think they've got one. They're importing more LNG at great cost, so that's also, a burden on the economy, plus the fact that Suez Canal revenues are down. So I think they are very reliant on Israeli gas, and the fact that they're having to import so much LNG to keep things going. And because I think there's also limitations as to how much can come through the pipeline from Israel. And until they expand it, and they are doing it, they are going to be needing to import a lot more. So anybody else have something to say on, and you mentioned, I think you mentioned it, Karen, about the fact that the GCC countries were putting a lot of cash investment into Egypt. And I wonder if we can add to that and say, are they going to do the same with Syria?
No, they won't. So the Egyptian case is really interesting. Also, there was a pivot after sort of the use of economic statecraft from 2011 to about 2018, when it started to slow down. And then the most recent cash injections into Egypt from the UAE have been a land purchase, the Ras Al Hekma, which basically they took about $10 billion, which had been a central bank deposit, and used it as kind of a down payment for a $35 billion land deal. So no more free money. They want a hard asset in return. But the thing about the shutting down the Leviathan field was it was a protective measure, right? It was not because the asset was hit in Israel. And that caused Egypt to then have to go to spot markets to buy LNG more expensively, and it's a total burden for them, absolutely. But it was actually, if we talk about oil and gas infrastructure in the region, which has been targeted in this war, it's in Israel. It was the Haifa refinery which was hit. And that causes a tremendous burden on Israel. They're having to import now about 50,000 barrels a day of jet fuel to keep those planes flying over Iran, because they do not have capacity to refine diesel or jet fuel or anything else right now. There are other major refineries in Ashdod, and it's unfortunately offline for repairs. So, they've got themselves in a real pickle if the cost of this war is, maybe $1 billion a day for Israel, and add to that their energy needs. So they are affected, but certainly, yes, Egypt is under tremendous stress. And the worst thing that can happen is that they start seeing those sort of sentiment of investors change, some, sort of movement of capital flight or, something to that degree, which I don't think we've really seen yet.
Of course, some of that oil used to come from Kurdistan, to Israel. And of course, that's stopped now if Soma is going to be marketing it. But Karen, you said no, they won't do the same in Syria. I mean, I would have thought that it would be in Saudi Arabia's interest having Syria so close.
No, I mean, they paid the arrears to the World Bank. That wasn't really any money. And then the Qataris committed, I think, $7 billion basically for electricity generation. But that is not enough to really jumpstart and create the provision of electricity for the entire territory of Syria. For that, we really need major investment and rethinking of what the Syrian grid would look like, what maybe distributed power could do in Syria. We're so far away from a solution just to meet sort of basic infrastructure demands in Syria, which has, of course, had no investment for many years.
Any other questions? Yeah, please, go ahead.
Not a question, but to push back a bit on this, I think a view coming from, I got the sense from the panel is that all the GCC countries are awash with cash at the moment, which I don't think is the case in Saudi now. And, you know, I think particularly if you ride on oil prices are going to be, you know, to the downside from where they are. Saudi's got some very tough decisions to make in terms of all of the commitments it's made domestically and internationally. So I think the environment where Saudi money was flowing very liberally in the last 3 years is probably not going to be the case going forward at these oil prices. Where that impact, clearly Aramco so far, capital spending has remained very high and the hit's been on the dividend. Whether that continues is going to be a trade-off by, you know, where does this money want to go? Is it PIF, government, Aramco? Is it elsewhere? So I guess I would be less sanguine about what the investment...
I think, at a lowest point today. It's been in a long time.
But but what about, I mean, the sovereign wealth funds are still flush. I mean, we're talking state budget as opposed to, or can we...
Well, I think they have so many commitments, and where the money is tied up is in a lot of projects domestically that are not complete for a long time, and they've benefited hugely from asset transfers from elsewhere in the public sector, which have largely now been exhausted. I mean, I'm sure they're not all being exhausted, but a lot of the easy ones have already taken place. So, yeah.
And maybe I would just add to that, in some international kind of boondoggles. I mean, I'm thinking about Ratnagiri in India, which from 2020, 2021 was sort of the biggest outward project investment from the Gulf, you know, in a long time. I mean, it skews the graph, and that's obviously in a mess just now, whether it's going to stay functional. So I think execution matters.
Any other comments? No. Sorry, Rachel, yes.
Only if we have time, because otherwise...
Yeah, we have. Hang on.
Just a thought that we might play into a little bit more, but in this context of new energy order, I think this sort of question mark about Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular in critical mineral space, I think is an interesting one, which we can save our time for after lunch. But I had a question for Colby. You mentioned XRG having sort of different criteria, and I think across the panel, you folks talked about how investments in the U.S. and the region are being considered. But I'm wondering if there's any more to be said about other jurisdictions, you know, places like, you know, Australia, how, or just more generally, are there things you're picking up about new geographies across the board? You know, in the last sort of year or two, you know, we're in a world where contracts are thinking about flexibility because of tariffs. Are there any shifts going on?
Yeah, I mean, on the Australia question, I don't want this to sound like a cop-out, but I remember hearing that the Santos thing was under consideration just in the last week or so, so I'm admittedly a little bit behind on that, and I know that you know, there are other investors that have looked into Santos in the past and walked away. So I think some of those things... Yeah, I think some of those things are still open questions. I mean, if you look at what the criteria has been on a lot of the gas and LNG, for XRG, it's usually gas that it's usually producing assets that have an LNG linkage or some kind of existing connection to other markets, right? They're not getting into this for exploration for the most part. I think Egypt might be a bit of an exception to that, but I think where you see some of those having popped up in the past, that might be a consideration. Off the top of my head, it's a little more difficult to say where that is. I don't want to say Cyprus because we keep coming back to the East Med when I think we don't always need to. But I think that's part of what you'll see going forward. And I think, the policy landscape probably has to change for a lot of the new energy considerations to come more front and center. Otherwise, it's basically chemicals, right? So, Karen, I don't know if there's anything.
I had just jotted down in my notes before the places where XRG has invested recently, and it's the Santos consideration in Australia, thinking about BP's LNG assets, 30% stake in an Azerbaijan field, 49% stake in an Egyptian company, 38% stake in a Turkmenistan block, 10% stake in a Mozambique lease, and then there are interesting things like who they choose as partners. So, like the Santos would be with Carlyle and ADQ, or they've made interesting deals with Occidental, which Occidental has work in the UAE, and then the UAE might invest in Oxy's like DAC in Texas. So the ability to make trade-offs in that way, I think, particularly with IOCs, is super interesting.
Yeah, that's another important point, too, because unconventionals are extremely important for the UAE's domestic gas growth. And if they do go up the value chain in the U.S., as they've basically said they're going to do, that's where it leads you.
Maybe I'll just one final comment along the same lines. I was in Oman just a couple months ago, just when the tariffs were still on before they had been taken off. So to your point, kind of how trade policy is affecting tech transfer, and speaking to a local sort of oil field services firm that was doing things like they were trying to source in their supply chain explosives at the end of the drill bit for unconventional, and had been sort of in a relationship with American suppliers for decades. And suddenly there was a question for a relatively smaller player: how do I sort of rebalance my supply chain in the face of these potential tariffs? And I think the answer was these things are remarkably sticky, because even if there are Russian, German alternative suppliers that they can go to, so much of this is calibrated specifically for the Omani rock in this case, and it's sort of compliant with the rest of the technology throughout their suite. So that was something that really struck me, that actually reorienting those supply chains within the oil and gas sector is a lot stickier than just than we think. So that uncertainty is going to prompt a lack of movement.
And to add to what Karen was talking about, all these investment opportunities, let's not forget that ADNOC is supposedly one of the possible suitors of BP and apparently they've had it's been on the cards, and they've prepared it some while back before. And that's another sort of example of their global ambition. I don't think it's going to happen, but if it does, it'll be bits and pieces of BP, not the whole thing. And I think it's lunchtime, so I'm going to thank my panel. I'm not going to keep you from lunch. We're 2 minutes over. And I want to thank Phillip and Karen and Colby for being part of this conversation. Thanks.